A bill to fund the government through September is now in the hands of the Senate. It passed the House on Thursday with support from both parties. The final vote was 256 to 167. 145 Republicans voted for it, as did 111 Democrats. But it's hard to imagine everyone read the $1.3 trillion bill. Its full text was posted after 8 p.m. on Wednesday night, and the bill spans more than 2,000 pages. Let's bring in congressional reporters Sean Sullivan and Molly Hooper in Washington. Molly's back. Sean is with the Washington Post. All right, so some homework to get through. But before we get to that bill, Molly and Sean, Thursday evening, former Playboy playmate Karen McDougal appeared on CNN to discuss a relationship she says she had with President Trump. Here's some of what she had to say.
As you enter a relationship, obviously in any relationship, you start to think about where this is going to go and how you feel. And how did you view it? How did you view the relationship?
You know, going through it, when I look back where I was back then, I know it's wrong. Like, I'm really sorry for that. I know it's a wrong thing to do. But back in those days, sorry.
It's okay.
Back in that day, I was a different girl. I had fun. I was in the Playboy scene. I was just enjoying life as much as I could. And, when I got with him, actually, there was a real relationship there. There were real feelings between the two of us, not just myself, not just him. There was a real relationship there, and I kind of out of sight, out of mind with everything else. And, deep inside, I did have a lot of guilt, but I still continued.
You believe, though, that he had real feelings for you?
Of course he did. I know he did.
He would say that?
He did.
Were you in love with him?
I was, yeah.
And do you think he was in love with you?
He was, yeah.
Did Donald Trump ever say to you that he loved you?
All the time. He always told me he loved me.
So it is a midterm election year, and I wonder how you think that Republicans are feeling about news like this, women involved in legal fights with the president, how they feel about that being in the headlines, Molly.
Well, it's interesting because when I talk to members of Congress about this, privately, given the recent Stormy Daniels brouhaha, so to speak, in the impending interview, they say they're not hearing a lot about it in their districts. This is a consensual relationship with a woman before he was ever president, before he was even involved in politics. And, unless it happens essentially when, unless it's non-consensual and the person's in office, I guess they just sort of feel like it isn't hitting home in their districts, in their races as much. There's other issues that people are talking about. I mean, this kind of ranks sort of in the Russia investigation to a certain extent, in that it's something that people that we're talking about here in the Beltway, and in the media, but not as much back home in the districts where the voters are.
At the same time, Sean, if you're a Democrat, is there something to be said for perhaps these continued stories emerging and continuing to occupy space on, on cable news channels, news programs, that in some way, shape, or form energizes Democrats, particularly women, in this midterm election year?
Yeah, I think if Democrats believe that if they can make this election about Donald Trump, if they can remind voters about the president as much as possible, that is the way that they're going to have success in this election. And when you have these types of stories, whether it's stories about the president's personal life, whether it's stories about the special counsel investigation, whether it's stories about the turmoil in the White House and the controversial things the president is saying and doing, that plays into the Democrats' playbook, because when you look at the president's popularity in some of these key areas where this election is ultimately going to be decided, it's not very strong. And so I think they want to focus on him. The Republicans, on the other hand, are looking looking at this midterm map and they're saying, we want to run on policy. We want to run on the tax cuts. We want to run on, the tax bill that we passed. We want to run on Neil Gorsuch, the fact that we got somebody appointed to the Supreme Court. They don't want the focus to be on an unpopular president. Anytime you have a story like this, it brings the focus back to Trump, and it reminds voters of however they feel about him. And the reality is right now a lot of voters don't feel good about this president.
Let's turn to the issue of the spending bill. Molly, who are the biggest winners and who are the biggest losers here?
Well, Jim Mattis is probably doing cartwheels. I mean, the Defense Department finally get a bump up in their spending. I believe it's $61 billion bump up. There's going to be pay raises across the military. I think 2.3%. Domestic agencies get maybe a 1.3% bump up in pay. I mean, the Defense Department definitely is the winner here. There's also smaller, more focused interest winners as well, and those include, oh my gosh, it's like this is such a voluminous bill. It's hard to say. If you look at Rand Paul's Twitter account, he's been live tweeting the bill as he's been reading it, and he points out sort of where the boondoggles are. A lot of money that's going to be going towards programs that for post offices, CIA, former directors of the CIA retirement funds, things like that. The losers. Well, the deficit, that's a big loser, and that's where you'll hear conservatives railing against it. And, just the fact that this is $1.3 trillion of spending in one package, in one sitting, at a time when the president and Republicans passed a massive tax cut. And even though the tax cut, Republicans believe that there will be dividends on that, trying to create more jobs, meaning more tax money coming into the federal coffers, it's still a big ask. And at a time when you've got reports from various agencies that there's been abuse, you look at Ben Carson and the $30,000 table, David Shulkin and his trip to Europe, Scott Pruitt flying first class. With a bill this size, it's rife with potential for abuse, because how do you manage that much money in one sitting? It's very difficult.
Well, there are some things in the bill for both parties. Most Republicans like the additional money for the Pentagon. Democrats got their expansion of the low-income tax credit and millions in funding for election security. Can Republicans, Sean, campaign on this bill?
Maybe. It's interesting when you look at this bill, in some sense, it's more notable for what's not in it than what is in it. And when you look at the amount of money that the president wanted for his border wall, he's not getting anything near what he asked for. When you look at the issue of immigration, there were a lot of Democrats who were hopeful that they could use this bill to come up with a deal to address the fate of young undocumented immigrants. Well, this bill doesn't do that either. And then when you look at gun control, an issue that has been heavily debated in the last few weeks on Capitol Hill, what this bill does is add some new gun control measures that a lot of Democrats regard as marginal or baby step type solutions to some of the problems that they see. And so, a lot of these strategies that you see in this bill, a lot of the stuff that ultimately ended up in this kind of falls short of what both parties' bases would have wanted. And so it remains to be seen whether this becomes a big campaign issue or whether this fades into the background. The reality right now is that Democrats today were generally pretty happy with this bill. Republicans on the Hill saw this as a net positive. They wanted to avoid a government shutdown, assuming the Senate can pass this thing in short order, depending on when Rand Paul ends his resistance. They won't have that shutdown. And so both sides generally pretty happy. We'll see where this goes. But, I think there are a lot of other issues right now that seem like bigger deals in the campaign when you look at what voters are talking about, when you look at what candidates are talking about. They're talking about the president. They're talking about the tax bill. They're talking about, sometimes to a lesser extent, the special counsel investigation. And so there's a lot on their minds and there's a lot on their plate. So, they might not even remember that this even happened when we're talking about, voters going to the polls in in several months.
Yeah, who knows what could happen between now and then. But Molly, President Trump got $1.6 billion of the $25 billion he wanted for a border wall. Most is earmarked for projects that were in motion before he was elected. Was this the president's last chance to get money for the wall?
Well, this year, yes. And if the Democrats take over control of the House and the Senate, yeah, pretty much. And so he better find out a way to get Mexico really to pay for that wall because,
right?
Because this is, I mean, this may be it. Unless of course, there's, Congress comes up with some way to fix immigration in terms of those dreamers, the DACA recipients, and, pairs that with border wall funding. But again, they weren't even able to do that in this bill. And this is the kind of bill where a lot of riders, policy riders will get added in the mix because it's a must-pass bill. And the dreamers were not addressed. And Sean did mention this. They could be the big losers in this whole saga, because if you remember, go back to January and February, and why did the government shut down? Mm-hmm. It was because of the dreamers.
Right.
But it wasn't really because of the dreamers, according to people that I had talked to at the time. It had to do with all these other issues as well. And, there's maybe $200 billion, I believe, for infrastructure, and that's just a morsel of what the president wants to spend on infrastructure spending. And really, pretty much once the Senate passes this, a lot of legislating will come to an end this year.
Yeah, let me follow up on that, Sean. I mean, this is the last big thing Congress is going to do in 2018, now that we are here, midterms quickly approaching.
Yeah, this is pretty much it in terms of big ticket legislation that Congress is going to look at. I mean, there are things that need to be done, big confirmations. Mm-hmm. There could be other surprise vacancies that happen either in the courts or in the administration that would force the Senate to hold even more higher profile confirmation hearings. But the reality is the table is sort of set. This is it. The tax bill was the biggest piece of legislation in terms of its scope and in terms of its political magnitude that was passed. And you're seeing, the divide emerge right now already in these elections. Democrats running hard against the tax bill, saying, look, this is a giveaway to wealthy Americans. And Republicans saying, well, hold on a second, this is going to put money back in the pockets of working Americans. And so, this is pretty much it. You look back at the last several months of this Congress, and, there were some false starts for Republicans. They were not able to repeal the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, the way that they said to their base that they were. So we'll see if they pay a price for that in the elections. But yeah, this is pretty much it. This is sort of the unofficial start to the midterm elections, because we're not going to see a lot of big sweeping things get moved around on Capitol Hill until the next Congress is sworn in next year.
All right. Well, maybe you both can catch your breath then. I don't know. Probably not, but wishful thinking. One can always dream, right? Sean Sullivan and Molly Hooper, thanks to you both.